Let me get started. Okay, welcome all. We're going deep into the prophets today, and we're going to be dealing with some angry prophets today. Angry prophets. Before we dive in, though, anybody have any questions, comments, anything from last week we got to follow up on? Christian nationalism, y'all good? Be watching for it. Signs of it are everywhere. Okay.
I had an interesting response. My husband had a doctor that was going to treat him, sew him up. And he said, "Do you mind if I pray with Jesus?" And my immediate response was, "Oh no, there's one of them." Then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe it was that big of a deal that he needed to do something special. And then I thought, look at me. Maybe this is just one guy that this is the best he can do to bring more love in the world.
Yeah.
And that was over about a 4-hour process. And I was very surprised at my responses.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if it were a school board meeting, that would be a different issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's begin with a moment of prayer. Will you pray with me? Holy One, you who breathe freedom into dust and call it good, teach us again how to see. Where law has become a weapon, let conscience rise as a counterforce. Where power hides behind piety, let prophets speak with clarity and care. Unmake in us the habits of fear and remake us for courage. When we are tempted to turn away, place in us the ache of empathy. When we grow weary of justice, let us rest not in indifference, but in community. Hold this nation, all nations, in your fierce mercy. Do not let us forget that every child of earth bears your image and that the wound of one is the wound of all. Amen. Okay, we are going 8th century Israel and Judea. So a little history before we dive into this. This period is before the Assyrian Empire is going to come down. And so it's before like the bad stuff happens. It's kind of the golden age in Israel and Judea's history. Now they've split, they're two different nations, but they get along really well together. And both nations, it's a period of this tremendous growth, political power for the nations, the two nations, and economic growth. But here's the problem. All of the economic growth rests in the hands of the ruling elite in the state bureaucracy. So all of the excess, you're going to hear this term, the surplus, the profit, and I don't use the word profit because it gets messy with profit. So the surplus, all of the economic surplus is going to go to support this really luxurious lifestyle of the ruling class. And it's going to basically pay for them to maintain control. And we're going to talk about how they do this. All of this is going to happen at the expense of the lowest class, the peasantry. So all of this economic gain is going to come at the result of the ruin of the peasantry. And this is going to be what makes the prophets furious. So how many times have you either said this statement or heard this statement? I don't like the Old Testament because that's the angry God, right? I hear it all the time. The Old Testament is the angry God. And almost universally, what people, if they can cite where that's coming from, they're going to cite passages that we're going to encounter over the next couple of weeks. And it's the voice of the prophets, and they are angry, and they're going to be channeling a furious God. And we're going to find out what they're so angry about. And there is some there about why they're so angry. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks is figuring out, okay, why why do we think of the Old Testament as a really, really angry God? Well, that's what we're diving into now, okay? Okay, so remember, this is two different kingdoms. You got the north, you got Israel, and the capital of Israel is Samaria. And we're going to hear that name a lot because the prophets are going to name drop Samaria and they're not going to like it. And then you got the southern country of Judea, and that's capital is Jerusalem. Again, two different countries, they get along really well. This is before anything comes down and destroys them. This is before the Assyrians, before the Babylonians. This is their kind of golden era, right? But it's all going to happen at the expense of the peasantry. To the north, you've got the Phoenician states. They're going to do a ton of trading with the Phoenician states. This is a time of trade. And we're going to get into how trade is going to screw the peasant class as well. Okay. Okay, so let's start with Micah. We're going to cover a couple of just a review of some of the prophets we're going to cover. Micah, Hosea, Isaiah, and Amos are the four we're going to be hitting a lot over the next couple of weeks. Micah comes from a small village in Judea, the southern community, the southern country. And because he was in this small village in Judea, he was an outsider. And he was sent by God to basically bring this critique to both Jerusalem and Samaria. So he's sent to the big cities to call them to task for what's going on, and is in the book of Micah. And Micah is one of the prophets that actually his legacy lives on. So Jeremiah is going to speak about Micah even later on. Micah, there's almost like a prophet playbook. And the prophets we're going to deal with are really going to have a couple of key things they're going to focus on. They're going to condemn the wealthy and the powerful for their greed. They're going to condemn them for oppressing the poor. They're going to condemn them for their perversion of justice. Wow. They're going to condemn them for being really hypocritical of their original religion. They're going to say that their religiosity is basically false, that they don't practice what they preach, right? And what he's going to say is that they have all these outward displays of piety and nothing matches what their actions are doing, right? With their inward stuff. So the prophet playbook is call them on their action and then tell them the bad thing that's going to happen to them if they don't change, but then offer this basically message of hope or restoration at the end of it. So that's kind of the prophet playbook. And Micah, we know because we all know this one. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Okay, Hosea. Now, Hosea, same time period. And Hosea is the one that we talked about that he is married to a woman who is a prostitute and she's incredibly unfaithful to him. And this whole metaphor, Hosea's marriage to Gomer is this whole metaphor as Israel's marriage to God, that Israel is equally unfaithful to God. And that's how Hosea tells the whole story. So Gomer will continually betray Hosea, and Hosea will continually take her back and forgive her. And the name Hosea itself means salvation. And the whole story is all about God's persistent love and this promise that God will never leave Israel, right? And it's the same thing. The central message, right, was about social injustice, idolatry, betrayal of this covenant with God. But Hosea is going to go a little further, and Hosea is going to say, look, you clean up your act, or the Assyrians are going to come in and basically destroy your country. And that's ultimately actually what's going to happen, right? Now, Hosea is really often quoted by Jesus, and this is something that these words are something that you'll hear in the Gospels. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. That's something Jesus is going to quote a lot in the Gospels, and that's straight out of Hosea. Okay, and then we got Amos. And Amos is a shepherd. And Amos was called to go prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel. And so you got the shepherd being called up to go. He's in the south and he's called to the northern kingdom. So he's really an outsider. And similar in terms of his kind of playbook, he's going to have this demand for social justice. He's going to have this compassion for the poor and the vulnerable. He's also going to have this demand for economic injustice. And he's going to call people on the ruling elite for their sins against the peasantry. And again, he's going to call them on their sins. He's going to tell them what's going to happen if they don't change. But then he's going to offer this message of hope and restoration if they do turn back to God. That's the kind of 3-step prophet playbook. And then this is the iconic words that Martin Luther King then took, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, that became, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That is pure Amos, okay? Okay, so those are the biggies we're going to deal with. Now, I'm going to drop a really big term on you, and it's a very simple concept, and it's what at its core is really going to piss off the prophets, and it's called latifundalization. And this is something that we are going to find embedded in all of the 8th century prophets. This is what they're going to be pissed about. And interestingly enough, it's happening today. And we're going to look at what it is. It is the process of land consolidation where small farms are absorbed to create large estates. And those estates live in the hands of the wealthy. And what happens is when those large estates become consolidated in the hands of the wealthy, the peasantry, the lower class, suffer. It's called latifundalization. Big word. What it means is the peasant farmers get screwed and the ruling elite develop these huge estates. So we're going to dive into this concept because this at its core is what the prophets are going to be furious about. Okay. Okay. So again, at its core, it's a concentration of land holding in the hands of a few. So in an agrarian society, land is the primary economic base, right? And the majority of the population are rural peasants or farmers. So the questions that are most critical to understand the society is who owns the land? How was the ownership acquired? And how was ownership maintained? And what we're going to find is that in the 8th century, the ruling elite screwed the peasantry out of all 3 of these steps. And that's what is going to make the prophets so angry. So as the number of people owning the land shrinks, so the number of landowners shrinks, which means the volume of the land estates increase, the peasants are at the losing end, and it's going to be disastrous what happens to them. So here's what happens. Here's how they got into that situation. High cost of production combined with the high cost of the the factors to produce, like seed, like water, like livestock, like food to feed their family. All of these factors force the peasants to borrow, and it's usually at a high rate of interest. And what we're going to find out in just a few minutes is you could take this exact statement from the 8th century BCE and change the date to 2025. The high cost of production, coupled with these farmers' inability to pay for the factors of production, force them to borrow at a high rate of interest. So what they do is they take out loans, but they take out loans on the value of the next harvest. So they're basically rolling the dice on the success of the next harvest. And if the crops fail, then they're going into deeper and deeper debt, and their capacity to pay is diminished. It's like this cycle of debt that's going in, right? So, and then they have this diminished capacity to repay the debt. And here's the gross part. You've got this creditor who wants basically to capitalize on the misfortune of the peasant farmer. And that's going to drive up the interest rate. It's a bad situation. So here's other ways that the peasants got into this bad situation. They're being forced to sell their crops at a time when the prices are always at the lowest. So all the harvest comes in at the same time. So they're competing against each other, right, to sell their crops at the same time. So they're forced to sell their crops at the lowest price. And then you're going to factor in, again, kind of this malicious component, which is they're going to be shortchanged by false weights and measures when the crop is divided. So they're going to be deliberately cheated. And we're going to see this in the prophets' writings because the prophets are angry about this. They're going to actually take the ruling elite to task for this. And we find evidence of the fact that they are cheating the peasants on how they are weighing and measuring the crops. And all of this is going to compound to the fact that the peasants are going to carry massive debt. And at some point in time, they got to get out from under it. And who is going to take the land? The wealthy, right? So the wealthy are going to scoop up the land and the estates are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And then if there's no recourse for any of this because the ruling elite control the courts. So there's no justice. And we're also going to find evidence of the prophets furious about the fact that nobody is on nobody's on the peasant side. They don't even have court officials that they could go to seek justice, to seek fairness, because they're all in the pockets of the ruling elite. Nobody's on their side. Here's another way that the peasants are getting screwed that we're going to hear about. The nature of the goods produced are going to shift. So, the peasants had to give up their land, right? So now they're just working on other people's land. So when they farmed, it was for their own subsistence, to feed their family, and they may sell some of the excess if they had it, right? But when they became these massive farms that are focused on production for an unknown consumer, they weren't producing subsistence goods anymore. They were producing things that were being traded. And they didn't have the resources to buy the staples to feed their families. So they were going to have to they were going into debt to feed their families. And again, the merchants were screwing them over because they were using rigged scales and weights. And we're going to hear about this in the prophets. So again, you think about, oh my gosh, the Old Testament, that is an angry God. Well, I hope you're starting to see just why that you're going to find an angry God here, because there's a lot of reasons for an angry God here that the prophets are going to talk about it. And it's all on behalf of these voiceless peasantry class who are just ruthlessly being screwed over in so many different ways. Okay, so in a subsistence economy, what you produce, you eat. But when it shifts to the States, again, you're producing cash crops for this unknown consumer that you're going to trade, right? And that surplus, that excess, right? It's not distributed to your family. If you have extras, it's not going to the family, it's going to the ruling class, to the elite. They have control over the economy. You don't get the surplus anymore. You don't get to keep any of that. Okay, other impacts. What they farmed. So under subsistence, again, they farmed to feed their families, cereals, vegetables. Under a market orientation for trade, no longer. They are farming grapes for wine and olives for oil. Those are the two big imports, because that is what gets maximum economic gain. So during this time, Judea and Israel are going to be sending out massive quantities of wine and oil. And the land is going to shift from these small subsistence farms to big estates producing wine, producing oil. They were easy to export, and in return, they got luxury items and military items. They didn't get food for the peasantry, right? So what it means is off season, the peasants had no work and no income, and they had to again borrow money in that debt cycle again. And they had no way to produce their staples. So again, they were in that debt cycle again to buy staples. So it's this awful cycle that's going to lead to an incredibly stratified society where you have a very small dominant class that's going to control the distribution of the goods and services. And their goal is to extract the maximum surplus, the maximum productivity and profit from the primary producers. All those people work in the farms. And they kind of have to walk this balance between getting the maximum amount and continuing to basically keep this group surviving so that they're producing. So you think that that's like, a gross enough situation, right? But there's more. This dominant group also maintained dominance through things like internal taxation. So the peasantry class had to pay taxes. And this was the primary source of transferring that surplus to the state. And that burden fell on the shoulders of the peasants. And in addition to regular taxation, there was very often special taxes. Like if there was a war or a building project, there would be special ad hoc taxes that they would have to pony up for. Heavily, heavily taxed society. And again, it's the peasants who are paying it, the peasants who are in debt. And they were often either military conscripted, meaning they were forced into the military, or they had compulsory state service. So they had forced labor to accomplish building projects. So with no choice of their own, forced into basically laying roads, digging canals, whatever the state required, they would have to free labor. They were not paid for this, taken out of their families and their geographical areas and forced to work on a state project. This is what was being done to this peasantry class. At this point in time, you should be angry on behalf of the peasants. So, okay, so what's going on here? So when you shift from a subsistence system, there's going to be a net market. The markets are going to develop and trade's going to develop, and the peasants are going to lose. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how do the lower class lose in trade? Another thing that's going to happen is urban centers are going to grow. And one of the things we're going to look at is how does the peasantry get screwed by urban centers? New territories are going to get colonized. The population is going to get increased. And the political control is going to be reinforced by economic control and vice versa. So it's going to be like this little cycle of factors. Okay, so in a distributive system, so we're moving away, right, from a subsistence system to a distributive system. Power is going to determine privilege. Power determines privilege. And the degree of inequity in the society is going to vary in relationship to the society's surplus. So, and with that surplus is going to come economic power. So there's going to be huge variations in power depending on that surplus in the system. So what Micah, Hosea, First Isaiah, and Amos are going to really take their constituents to task for, what they're going to be most descriptive about is this process of latifundalization, right? Land consolidation, where small farms are absorbed to create large, extensive agricultural estates in the hands of the few, the wealthy elite, to the deprivation of the peasantry. That's really what we're dealing with here. That's the context that is going to make everybody, these for-profits, furious. And that's what they're going to go after people on. Okay? Okay, we're just going to look at a couple of them today. There's more what they were mad about. And we'll get into this some more. Usury on the loans. The courts were not in their favor, and we're going to be talking about that one. The courts were actually in the hands of the elites, and so that was also. Okay, so let's look at one of them. So this is Isaiah. Isaiah 5:8. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. So everything I've told you about latifundalization is right there in that statement. Okay, so that's what the prophet is pissed about right there. So here's their response then. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing. Here's what God's going to say about that. Surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard, wine production, shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. So we're going to talk about those. This whole piece is all about that process of these large estates, right? So these small plots of lands that the peasants had have been taken over by the elite, right? So the land, the accumulation of land is growing in inverse proportion to the number of people owning the land. Few people owning big tracts of land. So, and these new landowners are contrasted starkly with the abject poverty of the peasantry, and who have basically lost their poverty and their legal rights. And what Isaiah is saying is So this first section, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field. That is the coming together of those large estates until there's room for no one and you're left alone in the midst of the land. That's Isaiah's talking about those big estates. And now Isaiah's going to go on and say, here's what God's going to do about it. Many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. So what Isaiah is saying is total desolation of these large estates of the upper class. There will be no one to possess the land. There will be no landowners, right? There will be total failure of the harvest. So remember, two major exports, wine and grain or wine and oil. So, and what they're saying is they will fail. God's saying those are going to fail. So God's judgment here for creating these estates is the rich are going to be deprived of the very things of which they deprive the peasants. That's kind of the prophet playbook. Okay, here's some Micah. And so this also kind of goes through, I can't see it. So a couple of things. So woe to those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. So Micah's talking about some intentionality here, right? They devise weakness. This is not accidental, right? They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. Okay, so that's what they've done. That's how they've screwed people. Here comes God. Therefore, says the Lord, now I am devising against this family an evil from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk arrogantly, for it will be an evil time. So God's pissed, right? Micah's channeling an angry God. On that day, they shall take up a taunt song against you and wail with bitter lamentation and say, we are utterly ruined. The Lord alters the inheritance of my people, how he removes it from me. Among our captors, he parcels out our fields. Therefore, you will have no one in the Lord's assembly to allot you a piece of land. Okay. So Micah really does channel this very descriptive, direct references to this process of the latifundalization, land consolidation, small farms absorbed to create the big, extensive agricultural estates. So he begins, right, by describing this intentional, malicious, wicked planning. This is very deliberate. This is not accidental. The ruling elite to do this, and then it goes in what they did, and then it goes into what's going to happen. What's the threat of punishment by God? And it's going to match the crime. Complete bankruptcy of the elite. They're going to strip the elite of basically all their socioeconomic and political positions in society. They lose it all. So just like the peasants lost it all, now the ruling elite will lose it all. That's the payback. So it's a really strong statement against this process. And Micah's saying, you knew what you were doing. You knew what you were doing, and it was deliberate. And Micah's calling him out on it. And by using that term inheritance in there, Micah's also saying that these powerful landowners have the court officials in their hands and that they're controlling the power and the outcome. And this is not what God wants, and God's going to judge them. And that judgment is going to fit the time. And what's going to happen? Those estates are going to be broken up, and they're going to be redistributed back to those who were abused by the system. And those who abuse the system are basically going to lose their rights in the sacred assembly, which is like the worst thing that could happen to a Jew. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Hosea. And this is the last one we're going to do before we look at what this is like today. So Hosea 5:10, the princes of Judea, so the ruling elite, have become like those who removed the landmark. On them I will pour out my wrath like water. So this is one where context is everything. So let's learn a little bit more about landmark. So this passage is really, again, about land accumulation, specifically by court officials. And what Hosea is upset about is deliberately tampering with the boundary marks of the small plots and basically removing them or changing them in order to get them in the hands of the large estates. He's talking about landmarks. And here's what he's referencing, these property boundaries. And there's a couple of different ways it shows up in other places. You must not move your neighbor's boundary marker set up by former generations that will be allotted to you. Cursed be anyone who moves a neighbor's boundary marker. Do not remove the ancient landmark that your ancestors set up. Do not remove an ancient landmarker or encroach on the fields of orphans. So this is something that is just a part of the understanding of these small farms, that these landmarks, these boundaries are sacred almost, right? And they're being messed with. And so it's not just a legal issue, it's like a holy issues, right? So in all of these verses, that concern is about preserving that boundary line established by these ancestral allocations of lands. And latifundalization was a violation of that. And the peasants were being stripped of these plots because of this estates. And that's what Hosea is mad about. Okay, before we go into what's happening now, let me just stop there and make sure everyone's okay with that. This is why the prophets, first Isaiah, Micah, Hosea, Amos, are so angry. This is why often you hear, I don't like the Old Testament because it's such an angry God. This is why that God is so angry. It is on behalf of the peasantry who have just been so horrifically screwed over by the ruling elite in the 8th century BCE. Any questions on this? Everybody good? Okay. Very, very shocking parallels to what's going on in our country right now. So let's talk about land accumulation in our country. So in 1954, we had almost 5 million farms covering 1.5 billion acres of land. By 2022, we were down to just about 2 million farms on 880 million acres. In that time, the average farm size doubled. And this trend of farms getting fewer and bigger really had started from the 50s. And family farms now are being absorbed by larger corporate investors. So right now we have more than 140,000 farms disappearing just in the 5 years between 2017 and 2022. So translate or switch out the word ruling elite from 8th century BCE and put in corporate farming for our current date time, and you can almost run parallel to the situation that's happening to farming today. So here's what's happening to farming in America right now. Small farms are facing severe economic crisis. They've got market consolidation, limited market access, high production costs, and And all of this is leading to consolidation. Larger farms, a handful of very powerful corporations. Right now, the top 10% of farms account for 70% of total cropland. Top 10% of farms account for 70% of total cropland. That's a pretty shocking figure right there. Additionally, a few corporations control the essential inputs like seeds, fertilizer, and equipment. And you could probably name them: Monsanto, John Deere, right? And just a few large corporations control the processing and the distribution channels like meat packing and the grocery shelves. There's been so much consolidation that that there really isn't much competition for the farmers to sell their wares to. So what this does is that it leaves the farmers who are still operating independently with very, very little power to bargain, and they have to accept the prices that are given to them. So, so many farmers right now are operating at or below break-even points, and record high debt. So, U.S. farmers right now are projected at $560 billion in debt this year alone. Very high interest rates, just like 8th century BCE. And those are high interest rates not only on land, but on machinery, because the machinery required for farming right now is incredibly expensive. And, you know, this consolidation has really, really shaped agribusiness. It's not farming anymore, it's agribusiness. And there's also this trend of billionaires and hedge funds gobbling up farms as investment opportunities. So comparisons between our little 8th century BCE peasantry and today. So modern American farmers are really heavily encouraged to focus on trade products, so corn and soy. And oftentimes they're growing them at break-even costs. So they have moved away from subsistence farming, very similar to what happened to our BCE farmers, 8th century. Very much like the ancient Israelites and Judeans, American farmers are impacted by international trade policies. If you're following the news right now, what's happening to American farmers with tariffs is particularly challenging. The loss of the Chinese market for soybeans, that's directly impacting American farmers. And U.S. farmers right now are increasingly dependent on leasing land from corporate owners. They don't own the land anymore. They are leasing it from corporate owners. So they do not have the equity in the land. Very, very similar situation to their 8th century peasantry companions. You know, 8th century Israelites and Judean peasants, they faced direct land seizure, kind of debt slavery. We're going to talk about that. American farmers, they face bankruptcy. They face auctioning off all their assets, and eventually their property and all their assets are absorbed into large-scale corporate agriculture, agribusiness. That's what's happening to American farmers. Very, very interesting parallels with American farmers right now in 8th century BCE. So I'm going to stop there. Questions, comments, observations before we go for our questions for reflection. Y'all good? Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
So the prophets were saying that these big farms and mansions and estates were going to be unoccupied. That's what God said the retribution was going to be. How was that supposed to happen?
God's will. God's just going to make it happen. They're going to lose everything. Yeah. You're going to hear a lot of threats from the prophets about how really, really bad things are going to happen to these people who have done really, really bad things to the peasantry. And God's just going to make it happen.
Well, is it somehow related to them being invaded in the future?
We're going to get to that. A lot of the threats that are going to come, though, don't have to do with the invasion. It's going to have to do with them losing everything.
And is that what happened?
No, they more that it's the invasion that ultimately happens when they lose everything.
Okay.
Yeah. But you're going to hear some really, really angry words and very angry threats about what God's intending to do. So. Okay, so here's the questions I want you to spend some time on. So these 8th century prophets were furious on the behalf of the peasantries who were cheated out of their land and they were forced into poverty. So the question is, what do you think about the parallels we're seeing in our times to these sorts of injustices? So that's one question. And then the second question, if both 8th century prophets or 8th century peasants and our modern day farmers are being squeezed by forces beyond their control, to what extent should the government be held responsibility for guaranteeing our farmers the right to remain on their land? Okay. And I'll put that one in the chat one as well. So the two questions are, what do you think about the parallels we're seeing in our times to these sorts of injustices? And, should the government be held responsible for guaranteeing a farmer's right to remain on their land? Okay, let me send you out into 2 groups. And I will put the second question in the chat. Everybody got the questions now? Okay, there you go. I'll send you out for about 8 minutes.